Hello, everyone. So I'm going to start over from where we started Wednesday's lecture in case people missed the beginning. Uh, so on Monday, we were talking about the psychoanalytic theories and Freud and Erikson, and they were primarily focused on the unconscious, what's happening in the background of the mind. The cognitive theories, on the other hand, that we're going to be looking at, they really stress the importance of the conscious thought. When how you purposely and consciously think of doing things, or you solve problems consciously, you use your memory consciously. The three theories we're going to look at in this section are all really about conscious thought. The first is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. According to Piaget, two major processes underlie a child's cognitive construction of the world. Organization just refers to organizing our experiences in order to make sense of the world. We connect ideas together. We form what he called it schemas, or basically mental concepts. So, for instance, as a young child, I may have a dog. I see other dogs. I hear about dogs in storybooks. I will form a mental concept of what a dog is. That will be my schema. It'll be just kind of one mental representation that represents all dogs. Uh, so this is all part of organization. As we come across new knowledge, we organize it, connect ideas together, and form schemas. We also use adaptation, meaning that we just adjust to new environmental demands as they arise. We have to change our behaviors. The same behaviors in one situation won't always work in another, and so we mentally adapt to our new environments that we encounter as we develop. In Piaget's theory, there are four stages. The first is the sensory motor stage from birth to 2 years. During this stage, infants basically learn to use their senses and their motor skills. So they're learning to hear and to see and to make sense of what they're hearing and seeing. And they're learning how to touch things and how to use their motor skills to reach and to grab and to hold things. Babies can be seen to do this very early on in their cribs. They will just kick their leg or move their arm randomly in order to learn how to use those motor skills. So what Piaget believed was the first couple of years of life was really about learning to use your motor skills, learning how to use your senses, and then combining them and coordinating them together. Being able to see something and then reach for it and grab it. Uh, okay, it's only at the end of the stage that children start to begin to form what he called symbolic thought. They start to represent things in their mind. That is really the key of the second stage, the pre-operational stage. It's all about children from 2 to 7 years of age learning how to represent the world with using mental constructs. They learn that numbers represent quantities, so they have a mental construct of what two is, and they know what that would be like represented in the world. What two items means. Same as they start to learn letters and they learn language. That letters represent sounds, and strings of letters represent words. So these are symbolic representations that one thing stands for another. And it's during this 2 to 7 year period where their mental constructs really flourish. They can represent things for long periods. They can remember things. They're not worried when their mother goes to work because they have a mental construct telling them that she comes back home after work. Okay, So this stage is about forming symbolic mental representations of and holding them in their minds. But the one thing that they can't do is use logic on these representations during this pre-operational stage. So as we get to the third stage, the concrete operational stage from 7 to 11 years of age, their mind now becomes operational. So whereas from 2 to 7 it was pre-operational, well, what does operation refer to? An operation just refers to a logical mental um, action, I guess. Adding up numbers in your head is an operation, for instance. So it's an operation just means that you can mentally do a lot. You can do you can use logic mentally. Right, that's the easiest way to say it. You can use logic mentally. So in the pre-operational stage, they can't do that. Now they can do it. They can start to reason logically about concrete events and objects. Um, an example would be if I had dolls and I showed them, hey, look, this doll named, oh, let me hang on one sec. Alanis. Okay, I'm trying to think of. Sorry, I was trying to think of an A name. Okay, Alanis. This is Alanis. Look, Alanis is taller than Betty, and I show them the two dolls, Alanis and Betty, A and B, and I say, look, Alanis is taller than Betty, and they say, yeah, she is. And then I put Alanis down. I pick up a third doll, and I say, look, here's Betty again, and she's taller than Charlotte. Oh yeah, she is. And then I put those dolls down, and I say, hey, if I held up Alanis and Charlotte, which one would be taller? Um, Children at this age can solve that problem. They know that Alanis will be taller than Charlotte because if A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A has to be taller than C. This is called a transitive property. Anyways, my point is that if I do that same test with somebody in this age group without the use of dolls, they cannot solve it. If it's just all hypothetical and in the head. So if I just tell them a story that I have three friends and Alanis is taller than Betty and Betty's taller than Charlotte, and and I try to ask them who's taller between Alanis and Charlotte, they won't get it if there's been no pictures or concrete objects. So their logical abilities are tied to the concrete world around them. They have to be able to touch it or see it. It's only in the final stage, the fourth stage, from 11 onwards, the formal operational stage, that they can break that barrier of needing to only to needing concrete objects and events to use logic. They now can use logic in hypothetical ways and in abstract and idealistic ways, um, meaning that they can imagine scenarios and think logically about them. What if we were stranded on a desert island? What form of government would we decide upon, or whatever it might be? But what you find is that younger children, before they reach this stage, really don't engage in those kind of hypothetical reasoning exercises where they actually try to think logically about something that doesn't even exist. Now they can do that. Okay. So these are Piaget's 4 stages. I just briefly went through. What I'll say about them is that each stage is age-related. As you can see, the age is at the bottom, and each one is considered a distinct way of thinking. The different way of understanding the world in each stage. They are qualitatively different from one another. Okay, let's go on. The second and third theories in this cognitive area are Vygotsky's theory and information processing. Real quick with these two, we will revisit them again in a later chapter. Vygotsky emphasizes, as it says here, how culture and social interaction guide and are inseparable from cognitive development. So they guide cognitive development And he basically said you need them. Your mind only learns through interaction with others. So if I got to just believe that we learn from more skilled adults and more skilled peers how to use the tools of our culture. And tools are a term that can mean language, mathematics. You learn what's important to your culture through interacting with more knowledgeable other members of the culture. And that was what really made his theory different than Piaget's. Piaget didn't believe that social interaction was really important for learning. Piaget believed that we would just learn from our environments, and you didn't need somebody to tell you. Vygotsky believed that we learn from others. All right. The third theory is the information processing theory. It's about, I guess, what it sounds like, information processing. As it says, it emphasizes that individuals process information, monitor, and strategize about it. Information processing just means thinking, really. We perceive information, we encode it into our brains, we represent it into memories in our brains, and we store it for a certain amount of time. It could be a short time, a long time, years and years. When we need it, we retrieve the information. I can think about, and what's my phone number, and retrieve it. And all of this is just about the flow of information from the outside world into my brain, where I use it and store it, and I process it, and then, and if I need to, I can bring it back out of my head. I can share it with others. I can write it down. I can talk about it. Okay, those are the 3 cognitive theories. I'm not going to bother with evaluation. You can read about that on your own. The next set of theories are the behavioral and social cognitive theories. Here we have 2 theories we're going to talk about briefly. We have Skinner's operant conditioning and Bandura's social cognitive theory. As it says here, Skinner's operant conditioning says that development consists of the pattern of behavioral changes brought about by rewards and punishments. So this is operant conditioning that you would have learned about in 101. When we are rewarded for a behavior, we are more likely to increase that behavior. When there is a punishment following a behavior, we are more likely to decrease that behavior. So basically, as a child does some kind of behavior, they're either rewarded or punished, and that behavior is then modified. So the consequence following the behavior modifies it in one way or another. Bandura's social cognitive theory says that it adds thinking into Skinner's ideas. He also says that behavior and environment are linked, just like Skinner does. Skinner felt that you do a behavior, the environment is what rewards or punishes you. But what Bandura adds into it is the cognition factor. I'm going to go to the next slide, and you can see in the bottom left, the person cognitive factor. That is what Bandura adds to Skinner's basic model. The behavior and the environment were both aspects of Skinner's model. You do a behavior, the environment shapes your behavior. But what Bandura said is that we also have to take into account the person's mind, that they think, that they plan, and that this is going to also affect their behavior, and it will be also influenced by the environment. So just to give you an example, Bandura focused heavily on observational learning, which is imitation or modeling. He said we can learn by observing others. So I don't have to do a behavior myself and get a consequence. to decide, oh, I should increase or decrease that behavior, I could watch somebody else do the behavior and see if they receive a consequence. Uh, an example, I'm a young child and my friend Billy steals a candy bar from a store. He gets caught by the store owner. The store owner calls his parents and Billy gets in a lot of trouble and ends up crying. And when I witness this, I learn from it. This is Bandura's point. I learn as this is the person cognitive factor. I haven't done the behavior myself. I've seen Billy do the behavior. I've seen the consequence. I've stored it in my mind. I've represented it cognitively, and I can either decide to do that behavior myself or not, based on what I've learned from watching Billy. If Billy had gotten away with stealing the candy bar, I might be more tempted to try to steal a candy bar myself, if I saw him rewarded for his actions. But so Bandura says, Skinner's idea of doing behaviors and being rewarded and punished was kind of left out the fact that we learn by watching others. Okay, and that's what social cognitive theory really brings into the picture. And make sure you read all this on your own as well in the text. It expands upon it more. You can look at the evaluation of these theories in the textbook. This is a fourth set of theories. So far we've had psychoanalytic, cognitive, and then the behavioral and social cognitive. The fourth set of theories are the ethological theories. Ethology, basically, I'm just going to read what it has here, stresses that behavior is strongly influenced by biology, it's tied to evolution, and is characterized by experiences during critical or sensitive periods. So ethology really started with the observation of animals, and one of the main proponents of this was Konrad Lorenz. He did work with baby geese primarily, as well as baby ducks. But what he did was he showed that when baby geese are born, that they go through what he called a critical period when they attach to any large moving object. There's a short time period after they're born, and the first kind of large moving object that they see, they determine is their mother. They imprint to it. They just decide this is who I am to follow. And normally it would be the mother. In the wild, the mother goose would be there as the baby geese hatch, and they would see her first and learn to follow her. But what Konrad Lorenz did was that he showed that if the mother goose was removed, that they would imprint to other moving objects, such as himself, or he had them imprint to a pair of boots that he was wearing, or if anyone that wore the boots, they would follow the boots. He had them imprint to a bucket at one point, and they would follow this bucket around if you moved it around. So he had them imprint to different objects, as long as they were large enough, and he had these objects moving as they were hatched. They would imprint and follow them. So this is why you can see these geese swimming after Konrad Lorenz, just as they would their mother goose. Anyways, the importance of this ethological study was that he really showed what a critical period was. I'm going to define it for you here. It's a time when some aspect of development must take place, or else it will not take place at all. So imprinting is a prime example. It has to take place during a certain time period, or else it will not take place at all. If the time period went by, these baby geese would never imprint. And after they had imprinted to him, or those boots, or the bucket, even if the mother goose came back, they would not imprint to her. If the critical period had passed, then there would be no changing their initial imprinting. So this showed that certain animals have critical periods where there was only a limited time period for something to happen. So of course this led to thinking of whether or not humans have these critical periods. What we've discovered is that we don't quite have as well defined critical periods as humans. We have what's been called sensitive periods. This is a time when conditions are optimal for some type of development to occur. So the conditions are optimal for it to occur. That's not quite as rigid as a critical period. We're not saying that if it doesn't occur during that period, it will never occur at all, but it won't occur to the same extent, perhaps. An example is we can look at John Bowlby, and he talked about attachment, and that there's a sensitive period where this really should happen in the first year of life in order for optimal development. And there have been many examples in studies where they've looked at children like from poor orphanages and things like that, where they didn't have any consistent caregiving. And what happened is if they didn't, if they didn't attach to a specific individual in the first year of life, even if they were then later adopted into loving homes, they had trouble with attachment. They had trouble attaching to these new loving parents that wanted to care for them. They kind of missed that sensitive period when it was supposed to happen. It didn't mean it was impossible. It was just much harder. This is similar to language learning. If we have a sensitive period, we're supposed to learn language as children. If we try to do it later, and if we go, let's say, our first 10 years of life without learning language, we will never learn it properly later. Okay, so ethology. And this ethology, it's about, that it's mainly, once again, based on evolution. These are behaviors that developed in order to help a species survive. It's good for the baby geese to imprint. It helps them to survive because, like I said, normally it's their mother and they learn to follow her, which is good for their safety. It's good for human babies to attach during the first year of life, during their sensitive period. And it's good for them to learn language when their brains are optimally, meant to learn language when they're youngsters. And so these things are like, looking at behaviors and characteristics based on evolution, where species learn certain behaviors at different times. Okay, let me go on. Once again, I'm going to skip the evaluation. Our final and fifth theory is ecological theory. And we only have one theory. It's Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory of development. On the next slide, you see that there's 4 systems listed here that I'm going to define while I go back to the diagram. There's also a 5th system, the chronal system. It's not specifically mentioned on this slide, but I believe it's on the picture slide. Yeah, you can see it at the bottom of the picture slide. Okay, so there are actually 5 systems. So I will talk about them while I have the diagram up. And so this theory is really about all of the environmental influences that affect a developing individual. And what Bronfenbrenner does is he just shows different groupings of environmental influences, depending on how near or removed they are, and he shows that things that seem distant from the developing child may still influence them. And anyways, if I talk about the systems, you'll see what he's getting at here. So in the middle, we have the developing individual. They have personal characteristics. They're certain sex, age, they have certain health, etc. The first and most direct system of influence from the environment is the microsystem. This includes all of the environments and settings, or what we call contexts, that directly influence the developing child. So this would include, as it says here, the family, the school, peers, the play area in the neighborhood, the religious group that they go to. So these are all areas where the child actually spends time in. Okay. The mesosystem is just that short ring going around the microsystem, and what it represents are the interactions between elements of the microsystem. So that's why the arrows are just kind of going around. It's saying that the elements of the microsystem don't operate independently of one another; they affect one another. So a mesosystem element would be, for instance, let's say a child has a great time at their school, learning about treating others with kindness. And then that child goes home and he treats his sister much better than usual that day. So this would be something that's happening at school, learning about kindness, being transferred over to his family context. He goes home and treats his sister differently. And then so the mesosystem is just saying that one of these microsystem influences will influence another microsystem influence or element. So uh, okay. Going on outwards, the exosystem is next. These are elements of the environment that are more removed from the child, but still have an effect on him and have an effect on the microsystem. So friends of family, neighbors, legal services, social welfare services, mass media. So these are all things that the child doesn't have as much direct influence with. They're not prominent in the child's life, but they will still influence him in the microsystem elements. The one I'm going to talk about isn't actually listed here, but it's one I like. Is that if you think about the parents' workplace, that's part of the exosystem. So imagine your mother all of a sudden has to do more hours at work or work weekends. She's doing overtime perhaps, and the stress level's gone up. I mean, obviously, under these conditions, your mother's, it's going to affect her parenting somewhat. She's not around as much. Maybe she's under stress when she comes home. So her job is affecting her relationship with you. It's affecting the family element of the microsystem. Even though the child's not directly at the parent's workplace, they have no direct involvement there, but it's one system influences another. Okay. And similarly, if we go all the way out to the outer ring, we get to the macro system, and this represents the attitudes and ideologies of culture, including things like laws and norms and rules. And of course, they will influence the exosystem, which in turn may influence the microsystem, and then eventually the child. So if a social policy changes, then perhaps when my mother has a child, she gets to stay home longer because the parental leave laws have changed, for instance, and then she stays home longer to raise the new baby. I mean, that'd be one example of a social policy that will affect the family microsystem. There could be laws that affect the school system, for instance, and would change that element of the microsystem. Or health services, as it's certainly when the Affordable Care Act was started under President Obama, it really changed health services for many people. Many people that couldn't get them before were able to now. Okay, the fifth and final system is the chronosystem. This is a time system, and what Bronfenbrenner is pointing out here is that all the systems are in flux. As time goes on, they change. It's not just a static environment that will always be the same. And so all of these systems are being affected by time. over time the family may move. That would change the school, that could change the play area, the peers, their health services that they access, their neighbors would change, their friends, groups of friends may change. If they were to move to a new state or a new country, it would change the macro system, or even just a different area may have different, city laws or county laws. Okay, and that's Bronfenbrenner's system. It's really good for what it does. It's as far as identifying these different types of systems and how they interact. It's a good classification system. People use it when they talk about environmental influences. It doesn't go a lot beyond that. It doesn't say what's happening within the child's brain or anything like that. But it is good at identifying environmental influences. And those are the 5 types of theories. Once again, I'll just list them: psychoanalytic, cognitive, then we had the behaviorism and social cognitive theories, then we had ethology, and finally ecological theory, Bronfenbrenner's. Okay, most people don't just choose one and stick with it, though. Most people follow what's called an eclectic theoretical orientation, just meaning that they pick and choose the best from each type of theory. If somebody wants to talk about unconscious influences, they'll use psychoanalytic theories. Erikson's theory was good for adult development, looking at adult development. In the cognitive area, we got Piaget, Vygotsky, information processing, talking about how thinking develops. And then, Skinner is good at environmental influences. Bandura brings in observational learning. As far as ethological, it's really good at biology, looking at biology in critical and sensitive periods. And then the ecological theory looks at environmental influences and the connections between them. And so, each theory brings something different to the picture. The last section of chapter 1 is all about research. So in this section, we will look at how we go about conducting research, looking at some of the data collection methods. First of all, we'll talk about research designs and talk about correlational studies versus experiments. And then we will get into the time span of research and look at some specific developmental designs that take into account that we want to see how people change over time. And so these are types of experiments that are specific to developmental psychology. The last 2 sections I'm going to leave for you guys to read on your own: conducting ethical research and minimizing bias. So data collection methods. First of all, we have observation, and there's 2 major types: laboratory observation versus naturalistic observation. There are pros and cons for each. One of the advantages of laboratory research over naturalistic observation is that we can control the important variables in a study. I guess I haven't really defined these. Laboratory just means you're doing the experiment in a laboratory setting, so you're controlling stuff. Naturalistic means you're observing in what we call real world or real life situations. So I'll give you an example of where laboratory would be better. Suppose I want to study aggression levels among 5-year-old boys versus 5-year-old girls. I might have mentioned this example the first day, but if I was to do that study, I could go to a playground and watch kids play with one another and see whether the 5-year-old boys or the 5-year-old girls are more aggressive. But I go to some playground just out in a community somewhere, I'm not going to end up with just a bunch of 5-year-olds. I'm going to have older kids and younger kids, and there might be some teenagers hanging around, and there's parents, that sitting and watching and doing various levels of interaction. And so it's a mishmash of different ages and children, teens, and adults. I would have different numbers of boys and girls, and I mean it would be just so hard to get any kind of meaningful data from such a mishmash of subjects. If I want to study 5-year-olds, I mean, I only want 5-year-olds at this playground. So a laboratory setting would allow me to control those variables. And there are playgrounds set up at certain major universities where they do research and they bring children in to go in the playground where they have cameras watching these playgrounds, and they can record everything the children do. So I could specify exactly how many boys and girls I want, and I could control their ages, and I could keep the parents, at a distance or out of sight even. And so you can have all the control to get to what you really want without interference of other variables that aren't important to your study. Right. Criticisms. Well, with the laboratory in laboratory observation studies, usually people know they're being studied. It's an unnatural setting oftentimes, and subjects may not be at ease knowing that they're being studied in an artificial setting. Uh, when I talked about the 5-year-old children, that probably wouldn't be a real criticism. They would kind of forget they were in a study, and it would become natural after a time to them. But with older subjects, it's hard to forget that you're being observed when you're in a laboratory setting. Also, people that are willing to come to a university to participate in a study are not necessarily representative of the population as a whole. There are many people that would be intimidated and would never sign up to come to a major university to do a study. And so you're not getting a complete representation of the population. Okay, let me move on now. Surveys and interviews. These are pretty straightforward. Surveys, a set of questions that you administer. It can be done through the mail. It can be done on the internet. And also, if we do it in person, it's considered an interview. So the advantage or the good things with surveys is that they're quick and they're easy, and you can get large numbers of responses. For fairly low price and low time spent. I mean, back in the days before the internet, you would have a whole bunch of surveys copied, and then just for the price of a stamp each, you would mail out 10,000 surveys all around the U.S. or however many, and then asking people to respond, and you wouldn't get them all back, but you'd get a good number of them. Now with the internet, it's even cheaper and easier. You can set up websites, you can direct people there to do the survey, maybe offering a prize to, if they're lucky, you have a little drawing or something. But you can get large numbers of responses, once again, without much time spent and without much money spent. Interviews are a little bit more, obviously, a little harder and a little bit more costly if you're doing in-person interviews, but they give you the benefit of being able to do follow-up questions based on responses in a direct interview. Okay, other methods. We have standardized tests. Standardized tests are things like SAT test or IQ test or personality test, where it's standardized just means it's always delivered in the same fashion. It usually means it's been around and have been used a lot before, so we have a lot of data on it. The criticism is that these tests assume that a person's behavior is consistent and stable. I mean, you do the test once, and then that's kind of a representation of something about you. You do an IQ test, and it's like, this is your IQ, it's at 115, and you kind of live with that. It's assumed that that's your IQ, unless you take another one at some point. But it's when you do the SAT, most people do it one time, and that SAT score is going to follow you around for a while. It's considered a representation of your aptitude for college and university, and so it's a lot of assumption that this is represents something meaningful about you based on a number of hours of taking a test, usually a few hours. Um, and we know that behavior is not so consistent and stable. It's possible that if you were to do the same test a week later, you would do better, maybe you'd do worse. And maybe, it depends sometimes how you feel that particular day, etc. Okay, case studies. Um, in in almost every type of study, we want a large number of subjects. This is a general truth of research. The more people you research, the stronger and better your results are. So why would we ever look at a single individual in a case study? Um, well, the answer is that we would do it when there's not really any other choice. It's not done because, oh, we're going to study this person so in depth that we can only do one person. I mean, what when I pose this to students, I always say, imagine we have as many researchers as we need and as much money as we need, but sometimes we would still only look at a single individual. So it's not a question of we're spending so much time or so much money that we can only do one subject. It's usually the case that there is only one subject or there's only a handful of subjects that meet certain criteria because they are unique in some way. So some famous case studies. One was Sybil. She was a woman that had about 23 personalities or something like that. Some over 20 personalities, multiple personality case. There was HM. He was a man that went through an operation and lost the ability to form new memories. He was studied for the rest of his life, for decades to come afterwards. There was Phineas Gage, who had the railroad spike go through his skull. This is back 100 years ago or so, and so they studied him and to see how it would affect his personality. In fact, they had this big metal spike that went through his head. In all these cases, they're not cases that repeat. No one else had a railroad spike go through their skull, and we don't find you don't find too many people that have 20 something personalities, and there aren't many people that lose the ability to form new memories. So case studies are for unique individuals. Okay, physiological measures. These just mean biological. We're doing some kind of biological measurements. Here's some examples listed here. We might measure hormones such as cortisol, which is what you release in the fight or flight situation. Neuroimaging or an fMRI, meaning we're looking at the brain, doing a brain scan. Electroencephalography. Electroencephalography. Okay, I can't even say it. This is EEG. Okay, so it's an EEG. That's when you get that little waveform output, and it's often used in sleep research. You can see all the different stages of sleep as the person goes through them. Gene testing is one of the newer forms of biological measurement. You could add other things here, heart rate, for instance, and I don't know, breathing rate and things like that could be measured. Galvanic skin response have been measured and studied before. That's what they use in lie detector tests. Okay, going on. So those are all different methods of collecting data. They don't define the study, they just define how you're getting the data. Research designs are kind of like the outline of the study. What kind of study are you doing? So those are data collection methods. Research designs, we're going to talk about 3 different types, mainly. Descriptive research, I'm just going to briefly touch on here. Designed to observe and record behavior. So you're just learning about a behavior. You're not going in with you don't have to go in with a hypothesis or anything like that with descriptive research. For instance, let's say I want to keep track of, I might decide to keep track of how many students carry cell phones in their hand as they walk by a hallway at, at Monroe Community College. So I might spend an hour in one hallway and I just have a little pad and paper and I record how many students I see with cell phones in their hands versus how many don't have them. I mean, you know, I'm learning about, I'm curious about how many are actually carrying around. Is it a high percentage or is it somewhere around 50%? I mean, and it may be that I'm eventually want to do a study having to do with people walking around with their cell phones, but I'm just initially starting with descriptive research so I can find out some facts about it. Okay. One type of descriptive research is correlational research. We talked about this at the beginning of the class on Monday as we did the happiness study. We took a look at the happiness study. Correlational research, once again, it describes the strength of the relation between two or more events or characteristics. It says two or more, but it's always based on two at a time. You compare two variables, so variables are compared in pairs. When you compare them, there's some mathematical calculations that go on that produce what's called a correlation coefficient, which is used to describe the degree of association between the two variables. How strongly are they related? That's what they mean by degree of association. The numbers range from -1 up to +1. The higher the correlation coefficient, whether positive or negative, the stronger the association between the two variables. So if I just quickly go over to my whiteboard now, and let me just make sure I can do this. Okay. Okay, so this is just looking at the top left here. I just have a couple of correlations mapped out here. Suppose I have a little stand outside of my school here where I sell beer. And I sell beer there all year round. Every day I record how many beers I sell. I also record the temperature outside. And at the end of the year, when I put those two columns of numbers side by side and I do my mathematical calculations, I find out that there's a correlation of +0.3. I also sell coffee out of the same stand. I record the temperature and the coffee sales every day of the year. When I do the calculations, I end up with a correlation coefficient of -0.5. First of all, out of these two correlations, which one is stronger? Okay, the stronger one is the -0.5. When you look at strength, it doesn't matter if it's negative or positive. The higher the number, the stronger the correlation. So the -0.5, it's a moderate correlation, moderate strength correlation. Remember, it can go up to 1. The 0.3 is a somewhat lower correlation, still significant, but you know, a little bit more on the low end. But we can see that the coffee sales, based on these, seem to be more more strongly related to temperature than the beer sales. Now, what does a positive versus negative mean? Well, the positive means that the numbers are going in the same direction, that higher numbers on one variable go with higher numbers on the other, low numbers go with low numbers. So I sell more beer when temperatures are higher. I sell less beers when temperatures are lower. Well, that makes sense. I'll probably sell less beers in the winter, more beers in the summer. The coffee sales, the negative correlation means that it's the opposite direction. High numbers go with low numbers. So I have higher coffee sales when temperatures are lower. And I have less coffee sales when temperatures are higher. And that also makes sense. I will sell less coffee in the summer compared to the winter when I'll sell more. So the negative and the positive tell you that whether the variables go in the same direction or in opposite directions. All right, let me go back to the slide. Okay. What would a correlation of 0 mean? Well, hopefully you could figure out, well, you know, the lower the correlation, the less related. So a correlation of 0 or something close to 0 would mean that there's no relationship between the variables. If I was to take all of your IQs and all of your shoe sizes, you'd probably end up with a correlation near 0, because I don't think bigger or smaller feet has anything to do with your IQs. Okay, here's an example of a correlation from research. As permissive parenting increases, children's self-control decreases. Okay, so as permissive parenting goes up, children's self-control goes down. Right away, we know that this is a negative correlation just with that one sentence, because one variable is increasing while the other one makes the other one goes down, or the other one's going down while one increases. So that tells us it's a negative correlation, different directions. There are a number of possible explanations for this correlation. And because there are a number of explanations that are possible, this is why you might have heard before that the correlation does not equal causation. Just because we know that permissive parenting is correlated to children's self-control, we cannot conclude that one of them causes the other. We haven't done anything to control the variables in any way. We just know that they're related. So there are different possible ways that this correlation can come about. I'm going to go to the next slide. Here are 3 ways that correlation could come about. Perhaps permissive parenting causes children's lack of self-control. Well, that's what many people would think right away. As your parenting becomes more permissive, children's self-control goes lower. But it could be the opposite direction. Maybe as children's self-control goes lower, it causes parents to become more permissive. Maybe they feel like, that they just can't win. So it may be the children's behavior causing the parents' behavior rather than the other way around. And then finally, there's always the possibility that there's a third variable, something else that causes the relationship, something that affects both of the correlated variables. So in this case, they're mentioning genetic tendencies or poverty may cause both permissive parenting and children's lack of self-control. So if it was the fact that they were in poverty, and we know that poverty is somewhat related to permissive parenting, we also know it's somewhat related to children's lack of self-control. Maybe it's the poverty causing the relationship between those other 2 variables. Also, once again, it could be genetics. They share genetics. Okay. So anyways, because there are multiple explanations, there's nothing in the numbers or in the data that tells us which one is correct. So this is why you cannot make a conclusion that you know what causes what. There are too many possibilities. Okay, this is just basically the same thing in picture form. Okay, so I talked briefly about descriptive research. I talked about correlational research as one of the major types of descriptive research. Finally, we have experimental research, and this is specifically designed to study causality. It is the one way that you can end up saying that one thing causes another based on the results of your study. It's the only research method to determine cause and effect. In an experiment, one or more of the factors are manipulated, while all of the other factors are held constant. There are independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is the one that is manipulated by the experimenter. The experimenter sets the levels of the independent variable. It's the one thing that's going to be different between the groups. The dependent variable is something we're going to measure. Dependent, I always think of data. They both start with D. The dependent variable is the data that we're going to measure to see if the groups are different. After we've manipulated one of the groups, and then we do some kind of form of measurement, the dependent variable, to see if it had an effect, and are the groups different. I'll show you an example in a moment that makes it much clearer. We also label the groups as experimental or control groups. The experimental group is the one that we, try to affect in one way or another. The control group is the group that we compare them against. It's a group that we try not to affect in any way. It's a baseline group. So basically, in any experiment, we are going to manipulate the independent variable to see if it causes a change in the dependent variable, the data. So we're going to go to an example. And in this example, we start with a group of participants and we randomly assign them to two groups, one that we call the experimental group, the other one the control group. Random assignment is incredibly important as a first step in an experiment. You have to randomly assign subjects. They cannot already be set in the groups. It can throw the whole experiment off. Because by randomly assigning them, you can then say that the groups are equal to begin with. They did not form on their own. Imagine, for instance, I was studying teaching methods and I studied a group of Monroe Community College students versus a group of, University of Rochester students. I mean, if those groups are already set, I cannot say that I've done random assignment. The groups are different to begin with. There's a reason why some people go to Monroe Community College versus other people go to University of Rochester. I cannot say the groups are equal. But if I start with a whole group of subjects all from Monroe Community College and I randomly split them into two groups, I can make the point that they're equal to begin with. Okay, so that's the first step in any experiment, the random assignment. Then we have a certain hypothesis that we're looking to explore. In this case, we're going to explore, does meditating while pregnant help newborns' sleeping and breathing patterns? Maybe if mothers meditate, then the babies will sleep and breathe better after they're born. So we have our independent variable. The one thing that we're going to have different between our experimental and control groups is we're going to have the experimental group involve themselves in meditation while they're pregnant. The control group, we're going to ask them not to bother doing any meditation. Don't do anything special. So the control group, you actually tell them not to do anything special. They just have the group with no manipulation. The dependent variable is usually the same for both groups. You measure the same data for both groups to see if it's different. So we're going to measure newborns' sleeping patterns for both groups. We're going to measure the breathing patterns for both groups. So I have this in picture form. And let me just go back over here. And on the right side here, you can see that we start with a group of subjects. We randomly assign them to the experimental group. They're doing meditation. The control group, no meditation. You can see in between the two boxes, the IV, that independent variable. After these mothers have given birth and one group has engaged in regular meditation, the other group not, we're going to measure these infants' breathing and sleeping patterns, use the same type of measurement for both groups. If they turned out to be exactly equal, then we would say, hey, I guess meditation had no effect. But suppose the infants' breathing, sleeping patterns were improved in the group that performed meditation, then we could say, hey, how is it that they improved? There's only one thing that we did differently between these groups. One group did meditation and the other one didn't. It must have been the meditation that caused the improvement in the breathing sleeping patterns. Remember the breathing sleep patterns at the dependent variable, the DV. And so the question in every experiment is, does the independent variable cause a change in the dependent variable? If the dependent variable measurements are different, we say yes, the independent variable had an effect. If they end up being equal or close to equal, we say no, there was no effect of the independent variable. This is an experiment. At the end of this, if it works, I can say meditation caused the infants to breathe and sleep better. And it would be supported by this study if the numbers, matched up with that conclusion. So you can end up with a firm cause and effect statement. One thing caused another in my study. Okay. Finally, we have the time span of research. And in developmental research, we are interested in looking at how things change over time. How is it that a 9-year-old is different from an 8-year-old, is different from a 7-year-old, etc. So because we are looking at development, we're looking at a time period, a time span period. There are 2 experiments that are specific to looking at changes that happen during development, as age changes. One is called the cross-sectional approach. And in this approach, I gather together individuals of different ages and compare them on some behavior or skill to see how they differ. How are the 11-year-olds different from the 8-year-olds, different from the 5-year-olds, for instance? In the longitudinal approach, I get one group of individuals and I study them over a period of years, or it doesn't have, usually it's over several years. I study them over a period of time. Let me once again go to my whiteboard. And so here we see, if you look on the left side, it's in 2020, and you can see the dates at the bottom. So it's this year. I want to do an experiment this year and get it over with. So I might do a cross-sectional then. I get a group of 5-year-olds, a group of 8-year-olds, a group of 11-year-olds. And I'm seeing how some skill changes from 5 to 8 to 11. Maybe I'm studying a mathematics learning skill or something, or language skills or something like that, and how they change. It doesn't matter what I'm studying, but I can compare 5 versus 8 versus 11 to see, hey, how much change goes on between these 3-year periods. If I do a longitudinal study, you can see that I start with a group of 5-year-olds, top left, and then I measure them for their skill level. In 2023, 3 years from now, they would be 8 years of age. I would measure them again. 3 years after that, in 2026, it would be 11. I'd measure them again. That is a longitudinal study. Obviously, it takes much longer. It's much more expensive. You have to keep track of these subjects over years to get a hold of the same subjects again. Subjects drop out. There's a lot of attrition that goes on, and that can affect the results. So you have to start with large samples. But in the end, it's often considered worth it. Longitudinal studies are considered much more accurate, and they have just a lot better data in them because you're watching individuals change. You can see individual patterns. Look, this subject went down and then back up on this skill. This other subject, they went up and then back down. Why do they have different patterns? I mean, you can see individual patterns and how, especially over many measurements over many years. And so the data is much richer. It's just it's data that can lead to much firmer conclusions. So they are preferred, but obviously, once again, longitudinal, much more expensive, time consuming. There are experiments that are longitudinal experiments that are done over the lifetime of subjects. They have babies enrolled in longitudinal studies where they try to follow them throughout their whole lives until they die. So there have been studies that have gone 90 years or 100 years longitudinal studies. So obviously, different researchers take over the study over time. There are many longitudinal studies like that, lifespan studies going on in different parts of the states that keep, where they keep getting added to over the years, like new sets of subjects are added at different points, and then they join the study and are followed. So some subjects just continuously run, and different researchers tap into them to look at changes at different ages. It's very, very interesting stuff. So anyways, those are the 2 major types. Cross-sectionals, more fast and dirty and easy to get results. Longitudinals, more fulfilling. The results are more fulfilling, but it takes longer and it's more expensive. Okay, I'm going to skip cohort effects. You guys read about it on your own. Once again, look at ethical guidelines on your own as well. And that concludes chapter 1. Our next video will cover chapter 2. See you then.